to all of you in Indonesia and outside Indonesia.
Where is Belinda?
Selamat pagi, Bu.
Selamat pagi, Pak Dirjen.
Selamat pagi. Ya, terima kasih sudah diundang. Saya nanti akan menyampaikan keynote speak-nya Pak Menteri ya, Bu ya.
Ya. Ini MC-nya masih ada gangguan, sebentar lagi kita sudah bergabung. Sebentar lagi kita buka, Bapak. Terima kasih.
Mohon maaf, saya akan mulai kembali. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning to all of you in Indonesia and outside Indonesia. It is my great pleasure to welcome to Brawijaya International Law Conference. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Belinda and I will be hosting this conference today. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to extend my warm welcome to Secretary of Directorate General of Law and Human Rights Ministry of Law and Human Rights Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Bambang Iriana Jaya Atmaja, and the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya, Dr. Muhammad Ali Dramat, and the distinguished speaker, Laura Baron Mendoza and Dr. Elizabeth Kramer. I also welcome all participants who attend in this Brawijaya International Law Conference, which is organized by the Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya. Ladies and gentlemen, on this occasion, I would like to inform you to the agenda of the event, the opening remarks by Mrs. Hikmatul Ula and Dr. Muhammad Ali Dramat, presentation by our keynote speakers today, Mr. Bambang Iriana Jaya Atmaja, followed by the presentation that will be delivered by the three speakers. After that, we will open the question and answer session, which will be led the moderator, Dr. Patricia Audrey. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Mrs. Hikmatul Ula to deliver his opening remark. Please welcome.
Thank you, Mrs. Belinda. Dear Dean of Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya, Mr. Muhammad Ali Dramat. Dear Minister of Law and Human Rights of Republik Indonesia, represented by the Secretary of Directorate General of Law and Human Rights, Mr. Bambang Iriana Jaya Atmaja, all panelists, presenters, and all distinguished participants. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude and thanks to God who has given us blessings and an opportunity so that we can hold this conference in this midst of an uncertain pandemic situations. This Brawijaya International Conference, BILC, is an annual international conference organized by International Law Department, Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya. In the second year, BILC takes the theme International Cooperation in Promoting and Protecting Human Rights, Opportunities and Challenges in the Midst of Uncertainty, while the implementation of this conference is still being held online via Zoom and YouTube channel from 26 to 27 October 2021. BILC aims to increase the number of lecture student publications and also to enhance the understanding of international law through sharing with experts from around the world. In the second BILC, we have 10 experts from 8 countries who will present at the panel session today and tomorrow. They are Associate Professor Mr. Muhammad Ali Dramat from Universitas Brawijaya, Ms. Rika Kurniati, PhD from Universitas Brawijaya, Professor Claudia Tesreiter from Linköping University, Sweden, Laura Baron Mendoza from Abibe, Colombia, Associate Professor Dovil Glaud from Mykolas Romeris University, Lithuania, Associate Professor Elizabeth Kramer from University of Sydney, Australia, Associate Professor Sahrul Mizan bin Ismail from University Kebangsaan Malaysia, Prof. Yin Yin Win from Tangi University, Myanmar, Dr. Panita Kraison from University of Phayao, Thailand, and Ms. Yun Yun Wahyuningrum from ASEAN Intergovernmental Committee of Human Rights. And in the second BILC, we also get 42 articles from various universities in various countries, which will be presented at the chamber session today and tomorrow. Last but not least, I would like to thank all those who have supported and participated in this conference, to the committee who have worked hard to prepare this interesting conference. Last I said, thank you very much. Have a good day and enjoy the conference. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Mrs. Hikmatul Ula. And next, I would like to invite Dr. Muhammad Ali Dramat to deliver his opening remark. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you, Belinda. Dear Secretary of the Director General of Human Rights of the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, Indonesia, dear distinguished all speaker, all participant, and all committee of this international conference. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning from Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen. Alhamdulillah, thanks to the Almighty God for the abundance of health to all of us. Hopefully everyone in here is always healthy to carry out our daily activities. And as we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all aspects of human life, including the issue of human rights. The policies implemented by various countries have proven to be unable, or at least not yet unable, to turn pandemics into an endemics. On the other hand, the policy also raises various restrictions and violations, including human rights restriction and violation. In order to manage this condition, indeed, we need international cooperation. Therefore, we hope that these activities, this international conference, will be part of effort to encourage international cooperation for the protection and promotion of human rights during the pandemic. And I would like to express my gratitude to Ministry of Law and Human Rights that will give a keynote speech in this international seminar, and all distinguished speakers. Thank you also for all participants of this conference. Hopefully you will have a very fruitful discussion, and for committee from International Law Department. Thank you and enjoy this conference. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad Ali Dramat. And now I would like to invite Secretary of Director General of Law and Human Rights, Ministry of Law and Human Rights Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Bambang Iriana Jaya Atmaja for presentation. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, before I deliver the keynote speech of the Minister of Law and Human Rights of the Republic of Indonesia, allow me to congratulate and also apology from the Ministry of Law and Human Rights for all audience of the conference for not being able to deliver directly the keynote speech and represented in this forum. We have now the series of events connection with the commemoration of the anniversary of the ministry. So the ministry, the minister, and also all of the leader in the ministry now is in the Taman Makam Pahlawan Kalibata, and also in Tanjung Priok. We have there's an event there. So the minister however, has also expressed his hope that the Brawijaya University International Law Conference, with the term International Cooperation in Promoting and Protecting Human Rights Opportunity and Challenges in the Midst of Uncertainty, will be held successfully. Now, please allow me to read the keynote speech of the Minister of Law and Human Rights. But unfortunately, the Minister keynote is in Bahasa Indonesia, so please be patient for all the speaker from abroad. Yang kami hormati Bapak Dr. Muhammad Ali Dramat, Dekan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Brawijaya, para pembicara baik dari Indonesia maupun dari luar, kemudian juga para peserta konferensi internasional semua. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan dan salam sehat. Pertama-tama dan yang paling utama, marilah kita senantiasa memanjatkan puji dan syukur kehadirat Tuhan Yang Maha Kuasa, karena kita dapat bertemu dalam kegiatan Brawijaya International Law Conference yang diselenggarakan oleh Fakultas Hukum Universitas Brawijaya. Kegiatan ini mengambil tema International Cooperation in Promoting and Protecting Human Rights, Opportunity and Challenges in the Midst of Uncertainty. Semoga kita senantiasa dilimpahkan kesehatan agar kita semua dapat terus maju dan meninggalkan pandemi ini jauh di belakang. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian yang kami hormati, upaya pemajuan dan perlindungan hak asasi manusia merupakan mandat Undang-Undang Dasar Negara Republik Indonesia tahun 1945 yang harus diwujudkan oleh pemerintah dan seluruh pemangku kepentingan di Indonesia. Diplomasi Indonesia di bidang HAM di dunia internasional didedikasikan sepenuhnya pada kepentingan nasional Indonesia, membangun reputasi Indonesia sebagai negara demokratis dan menjunjung tinggi hak asasi manusia, serta memberikan sumbangan Indonesia dalam upaya global bagi pemajuan dan perlindungan hak asasi manusia. Dalam melakukan diplomasi di bidang HAM, Indonesia selalu mengedepankan prinsip-prinsip kerjasama dan dialog sebagai upaya untuk meningkatkan kapasitas negara dalam pemajuan dan perlindungan hak asasi manusia, serta mewujudkan komitmen global di bidang hak asasi manusia. Kerjasama dalam bentuk dialog tersebut telah mencakup berbagai isu pembahasan, termasuk yang terkait dengan hukum humaniter, hak anak, hak perempuan, hak penyandang disabilitas, mekanisme HAM regional, transitional justice, dan isu-isu multilateral. Kontribusi dan kepemimpinan Indonesia di forum multilateral tercermin dari partisipasi aktif Indonesia sebagai negara anggota Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa di pembahasan agenda HAM Majelis Umum PBB, khususnya di Komite 3 dan di Dewan Hak Asasi Manusia. Hal ini tentunya disinergikan dengan peran aktif Indonesia di berbagai forum multilateral lain yang membahas isu HAM seperti di ECOSOC, ESCAP, bahkan di Dewan Keamanan Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa, serta di forum lain seperti Gerakan Non-Aligned, Kelompok 77 plus China, Organisasi Konferensi Islam, ASEAN, ASEM, dan lain sebagainya. Selama ini Indonesia sudah 4 kali terpilih sebagai anggota Dewan Hak Asasi Manusia, yaitu untuk periode 2007-2010, 2011-2014, 2015-2017, 2020 dan sampai 2022, setelah sebelumnya menjadi anggota awal sebagai founding member pada periode 2006-2007. Hadirin yang kami hormati, Indonesia juga telah berpartisipasi aktif dalam mekanisme Universal Periodic Review UPR dari Dewan HAM PBB sebanyak 3 kali pada tahun 2008, 2012, dan 2017 di Jenewa. Dari ketiga dialog tersebut, Indonesia telah menerima sejumlah rekomendasi. Pada sidang Universal Periodic Review pada bulan Mei 2017, ada 225 rekomendasi yang diberikan kepada pemerintah Indonesia. Rekomendasi yang diterima pemerintah Indonesia sebanyak 150 rekomendasi dan 75 rekomendasi perlu didiskusikan oleh pemerintah dengan instansi dan lembaga terkait. Pada bulan September 2017, pemerintah Indonesia juga sudah menyampaikan 167 rekomendasi yang telah diterima dan oleh pemerintah Indonesia secara mutlak dan 58 rekomendasi sebagai catatan. Kemajuan Republik Indonesia di dalam mekanisme UPR menjadi salah satu elemen utama kontribusi Indonesia dalam upaya pemajuan dan perlindungan HAM di kawasan dengan melakukan capacity building dan berbagi pengalaman dalam menyusun UPR. Bentuk kegiatan yang telah dilakukan adalah kerjasama dengan kantor Komisi Tinggi Hak Asasi Manusia dan Myanmar dalam sharing of experience penyusunan UPR di Myanmar. Dalam kerangka ini, Republik Indonesia telah pula berbagi pengalaman dengan negara-negara lain di kawasan seperti dengan Thailand, Kamboja, dan Vietnam. Hadirin yang kami hormati, sebagai bagian dari komitmen global maupun untuk mendorong pemajuan dan perlindungan HAM di tingkat nasional, diplomasi Indonesia perlu terus memfasilitasi pelaksanaan kewajiban internasional Indonesia di bidang hak asasi manusia, tidak hanya melalui mekanisme UPR, tetapi juga melalui Badan Traktat HAM Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa. Indonesia merupakan negara pihak pada 8 dari 9 instrumen utama hak asasi manusia, yaitu untuk Kovenan Hak Sipil dan Politik, Kovenan Hak Ekonomi Sosial dan Budaya, Konvensi Anti Penyiksaan, penghapusan diskriminasi terhadap perempuan, penghapusan diskriminasi ras, hak anak, hak penyandang disabilitas, dan hak pekerja migran dan keluarganya. Sebagaimana lazimnya, dialog dengan berbagai komite tersebut telah menghasilkan berbagai rekomendasi yang akan diimplementasikan dan dilaporkan perkembangannya pada laporan Indonesia berikutnya. Berbagai isu tematik yang telah mendapat perhatian komite antara lain isu khitan perempuan, women circumcision, diskriminasi dalam perkawinan dan hubungan keluarga yang mencakup usia perkawinan dan hak waris bagi perempuan, hukuman mati termasuk dengan alasan kejahatan narkoba, perlakuan buruk terhadap tahanan, pemberlakuan hukum syariah di Aceh, kebebasan berserikat dan berpendapat di Papua, dan kebebasan beragama. Ini adalah isu-isu yang ada di komite traktat. Di samping itu, isu-isu juga telah mendapat perhatian seperti pendidikan untuk semua, kesejahteraan sosial masyarakat melalui jaminan kesehatan, praktek-praktek sunat perempuan yang masih berlanjut di Indonesia, kepemilikan tanah, diskriminasi termasuk kekerasan terhadap perempuan, ketenaga kerjaan, masyarakat hukum adat, kesehatan ibu dan anak termasuk angka kematian ibu dan anak, dan hak ekonomi sosial budaya bagi masyarakat di daerah terdepan, terluar, dan terpencil, 3T. Bapak dan Ibu peserta konferensi yang kami banggakan, pemerintah Indonesia telah terlibat aktif di dalam perkembangan Komisi HAM ASEAN atau ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights atau ICER yang terbentuk pada 23 Oktober 2009 termasuk dalam pemilihan wakil Indonesia di dalam ICER. Pembentukan ICER merupakan capaian penting dari upaya pemajuan dan perlindungan HAM di kawasan ASEAN sebagai komitmen negara-negara anggota ASEAN untuk membentuk ASEAN Human Rights Body sebagaimana dimandatkan dalam Piagam ASEAN atau ASEAN Chapter oleh para kepala negara dan pemerintah ASEAN pada tanggal 20 November 2007. Terpilihnya anggota ICER dari Indonesia yaitu Ibu Yuyun Wahyuningrum yang merupakan juga pembicara pada seminar ini atau konferensi ini, yang merupakan tokoh LSM, menjadikan Indonesia sebagai negara ASEAN satu-satunya yang menunjuk tokoh LSM sebagai wakil resmi pemerintah di ICER. Perwujudan mekanisme HAM di ASEAN akan menjadi sebuah terobosan besar di abad ini. Mengingat dari 4 kawasan besar dunia, hanya Asia yang belum benar-benar memiliki sebuah mekanisme penegakan dan perlindungan HAM regional. Hadirin sekalian, saat ini Indonesia juga tengah berupaya untuk meningkatkan pemahaman dan kesadaran terkait isu bisnis dan hak asasi manusia, khususnya dalam memperkenalkan guiding principles on business and human rights, implementing the United Nations Protect, Respect, and Remedy atau United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights kepada para pemangku kepentingan nasional melalui penyusunan panduan umum bisnis dan HAM serta serangkaian kegiatan diseminasi di tingkat pusat dan daerah. Kementerian Hukum dan Hak Asasi Manusia saat ini menjadi focal point nasional untuk bisnis dan HAM di Indonesia setelah sebelumnya dari Kementerian Koordinator Ekonomi. Selain itu, pemerintah telah membentuk gugus tugas nasional bisnis dan HAM guna menyusun dan merumuskan rencana aksi nasional bisnis dan HAM dalam bentuk strategi nasional bisnis dan HAM Indonesia, di mana penyusunan dokumen ini dilakukan melalui berbagai diskusi dan konsultasi publik dengan pemangku kepentingan terkait, baik itu antar pemerintah, sektor bisnis, dan masyarakat sipil. Bapak dan Ibu hadirin sekalian, dalam kesempatan yang baik ini, saya ingin menyampaikan apresiasi kepada Fakultas Hukum Universitas Brawijaya yang telah menyelenggarakan konferensi ini. Forum-forum seperti ini sangat diperlukan sebagai wadah untuk berbagi pengalaman dan praktik-praktik terbaik dari para pemangku kepentingan terkait berkaitan dengan perkembangan hukum internasional khususnya dalam rangka mendukung dan memajukan kepentingan nasional Indonesia di tingkat global. Akhir kata saya ucapkan terima kasih. Semoga Tuhan Yang Maha Kuasa senantiasa memberikan kita kesehatan, merahmati kita semua dan juga negara kita tercinta Republik Indonesia. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Menteri Hukum dan Hak Asasi Manusia Yasona H. Laoli. Terima kasih.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih. Thank you very much, Mr. Bambang Iriana Jaya Atmaja. And now it is time for the seminar presentation that will be delivered by our distinguished speakers. This presentation session will be chaired by Dr. Patricia Audrey. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Patricia Audrey.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Belinda, for the session. Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable speakers and distinguished guests, my name is Patricia Audrey, and I will be in charge as the moderator of this session. This is the first panel session of this 2021 Brawijaya International Law Conference. There will be 3 speakers in this panel. The first speaker is Associate Professor Elizabeth Kramer from the University of Sydney. The second speaker is Laura Baron Mendoza from ABB, Brazil. And the third speaker is Dr. Muhammad Ali Dramat from Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya. Before we begin, I have some notes. This panel will be run on 1 hour time, divided into 3 parts, and will be 20 minutes each for each speaker, followed by 45 minutes for question and answer session. And if you have any question for speakers, you can either raise your virtual hand or type the question in the chat box. And during the speakers panel session, please keep the camera turned on and kindly mute the microphone. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Elizabeth Kramer. Professor Elizabeth Kramer is Deputy Director at Sydney Southeast Asia Center, and Honorary Associate at the School of Language and Culture at the University of Sydney. Her research study is at politics, policy and discourse in Indonesia, includes also the tobacco industry and political empowerment to people with disabilities. Her book, The Candidate's Dilemma, Anti-Corruptionism and Money Politics in Indonesia Elections, is currently on contract with Cornell University Press. Without further ado, Associate Professor Elizabeth Kramers, the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen. So just give me 1 second. Okay. So can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Selamat pagi semua. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present on a topic that's very interesting and dear to my heart. I thank the organizing committee for inviting me today, and also thank you, Patricia, for your introduction. I will say that even though my academic expertise is in Indonesian studies, I'm actually going to be presenting on a completely different topic today. So I'm going to be talking about the human rights and international responsibilities in the response to the current Afghanistan crisis, which is a very contemporary and very pressing issue. So I hope it'll be interesting to everyone in the audience. Before I get started, though, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Sydney is on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the Indigenous people of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge their custodianship and the law of country that the University of Sydney stands on. And I wish to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, who have cared for country here in Sydney for many, many hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, so I'm going to start a little bit narcissistically with a photo of me. So this photo was taken many years ago. When I was 26 years old, I got a job working as an international development consultant in Afghanistan. I lived there for 2 years, and I worked on a number of issues, including gender inclusion in infrastructure projects, community involvement in environmental projects, and also on land tenure and ownership issues there. So I was working on issues that were very relevant to the day-to-day lives of Afghanistan's people. And I had the opportunity to make some good friends there, to work alongside local colleagues. And it was a time when I wouldn't say it was safe. There was still a lot of security concerns at that time, but it was a hopeful time. We did feel like the situation was improving, and there was a lot of hope that Afghanistan would become a more secure and democratic country. Unfortunately, that was a long time ago, and 10 years is a long time in politics. And as of last year, the situation in Afghanistan really started to deteriorate. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about that deterioration, as well as Australia's response to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan now, and some of the problems that I see with that particular response. So the first point of history, I guess, is in February 2020, so February last year, President Donald Trump from the US announced that he had signed a withdrawal agreement, and that agreement was with the Taliban to withdraw US forces from the country by the 31st of May in 2021, so this year. And that agreement was contingent on the Taliban agreeing to continue to assist the US with countering Al-Qaeda and other so-called terrorist groups in the country. But there were a lot of problems with this withdrawal agreement. three main problems as I see it. So the first problem was that there was no proviso or commitment of ongoing support to the democratic government of Afghanistan. And at the same time, there was also no requirement for the Taliban to commit to democratic institutions in the country or to protect basic human rights. So that was the first problem with this agreement. The second problem was that the US agreed, as part of the agreement, to release 5,000 Taliban fighters from prison in exchange for the Taliban signing the agreement. And this was a very big problem because the Afghan president at the time and the government did not actually agree to this clause. And it was a very clear undermining of the sovereignty of the Afghan government at that time, because it should be up to the Afghan government if they release people from prison, not the US government. And there was a lot of concern about how that would play out. The third issue, and one that we can see today, is that there was an issue of trust. Could the Taliban be trusted to uphold their side of the bargain if the withdrawal was made? And part of that agreement was to continue to fight Al-Qaeda and other so-called terrorist groups in Afghanistan. And the evidence that we're seeing now is that that's not happening. And there have been resurgence of Al-Qaeda attacks, tacit support from the Taliban for those groups, and also ongoing use of violence in seizing different parts of the country. So even with this agreement, before the US and allied troops withdrew from Afghanistan, we can see that there are a lot of issues going on. The sovereignty of the Afghan government was being undermined. There was also some uncertainty about what would happen after the presidential elections in the US. So I'm sure you all know that Donald Trump lost the election last year and Joe Biden became the president of the US. But this turned out not to be a huge issue because Biden also committed to the withdrawal of US forces. Instead of May, he set the withdrawal date as August 2021, and that has happened. The US government continued to say, leading up to the withdrawal, that they did not think that a Taliban takeover was inevitable. There was some speculation that it would happen, but Joe Biden particularly maintained that it was not a given. But as we have seen in the last few months, they were wrong. The Taliban took over the country quite quickly after the US troops withdrew. And by middle of August 15, they had already captured Kabul and had, not overthrown, the Afghan government had collapsed and the Taliban had taken over. So that's the situation that we see now. You may have seen some of these very concerning pictures that came out in August of people trying to get out of the country. There was a lot of fear, very well-founded fear, I should say, that a Taliban government would pose risks to a number of people. And this risk was so real and so palpable that people were rushing to the airport in Kabul to try and get out of the country. And you can see here, there is a picture of an airplane that is scheduled to leave Kabul, and it's completely full of people trying to get out of the country. Now, this points to one of the first issues with the withdrawal, which is that the targeted evacuation programs for people who were actually eligible for special visas, people who had worked with the people who'd worked with the US government and other allied government forces were supposed to be able to apply for special humanitarian protection visas to leave the country. These processes were not efficient or effective. So there were a lot of people who were stuck in Afghanistan, and they're still stuck there now because there are very few flights going in and out of the country, and the land border crossings to Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan and other neighboring countries is actually quite difficult. So there are many people who are currently in Afghanistan facing very real risk of harm and persecution. So who is at risk at the moment? There are a lot of different groups in Afghanistan who are currently at risk. Some of the main ones, of course, are women under the Taliban regime, Hazaras and the ethnic Shia minority, Sikhs, Hindus, members of the LGBTI plus community, of course, but I think also members of civil society and journalists. So there's a broad range of people who are at risk now with the current government in Afghanistan. Particularly the Hazara, who are the large, who make up the bulk of the Shia minority there. There's a historical precedence for genocide and for persecution. And there have been several reports across the entire country of Hazaras being forced to leave their houses, forced to leave their land, and being targeted in violent acts by the Taliban and other groups who are associated with the Taliban. Of course, another huge concern is women's rights now in Afghanistan. So the Taliban have issued an edict where women and girls cannot be educated in the same physical space as men and boys. For primary school students, this is not such a big issue because there are a lot of schools that are just for girls or just for boys. But it becomes more of an issue with high school and especially with university education. So in the past, in Afghan universities, women and men or girls and boys, they've been sitting in the same classrooms but separated in physical space. That's not possible now with the Taliban edict. And also under this particular edict, they are saying that only women can educate women and only men can educate men. And that becomes a problem in universities because there are many more male lecturers and academics than there are female academics. So although they haven't banned women from going to university, it's actually practically very difficult now for women to get a university education in Afghanistan under the Taliban. And in terms of women's freedom of movement, that's also another big issue. So they have, the Taliban have issued also rules about women leaving their houses. They have to be accompanied by a male relative at all times. So either a father, husband, or maybe an adult son. This is obviously an encroachment on their freedom of movement, but it also disproportionately affects women who are already marginalized. So women who are widows or women whose husbands have had to go to a different city or to a different province for work. It's going to be much more difficult for them to move around, to go shopping, to go visit other people in the community. So really basic movement is being restricted. And finally, I think for the current regime, really anybody who disagrees or doesn't want to follow the Taliban rules is at risk. So people who want to criticize the regime, people who want to advocate for democratic rights or human rights, anybody who doesn't, see eye to eye with the regime is at risk at the moment. So that leads us to this pending, looming humanitarian crisis, where there are many people who are at risk of physical harm even, but there are very few opportunities for them to actually get out of Afghanistan. And with that, I want to turn now to the Australian government and what it has been doing in Afghanistan. So you may be familiar that Australia was part of the Allied forces that entered Afghanistan in 2001 as part of the war on terror. And there have been Australian military troops in Afghanistan since then, up until August this year, concentrated mostly in the south of the country, so around Helmand and Kandahar provinces. And this is part of Australia's ongoing promise to the people of Afghanistan. So for almost 2 decades now, the Australian government has been living out this promise to help rebuild the Afghan country, to defend civilians against Taliban forces, and to help establish a sovereign state, including establishing diplomatic ties with Afghanistan, which it did. But of course, with the US announcement of withdrawal last year, it made sense for Australia to also withdraw. The number of troops in Afghanistan from Australia was actually quite low compared to other countries, definitely compared to the US, but also other NATO forces like the UK, Germany, Canada. So it wouldn't have made any sense for Australia to stay in the country if all of the other allied forces were leaving. So that military decision actually makes a lot of sense and is unsurprising. But what is surprising, I think, is the lack of planning and foresight with what would happen to the civilian population once the allied forces withdrew. And I think there are a few points worth noting here. So firstly, the Australian government did not have a clear evacuation plan. It didn't have a clear outline of refugee intake or humanitarian settlement, even when it became obvious that the Taliban were going to take over again. The Australian government also did not have a clear plan for Afghan refugees who were already in Australia, especially those on temporary visas. So almost 10,000 Afghans in the community in Australia who are on visas that are going to end at some point, and there's no guarantee that they will be able to stay in the country. And finally, the Australian government did not commit additional resources to the UNHCR or to any other international body that would be working to deal with the refugee crisis as a result of the Allied forces withdrawing. So to me, I think this is very telling. There was really a lack of consideration for what would happen next after the Allied forces withdrew from Afghanistan. And the fact that these plans weren't made is even more surprising, because if you follow any of the political commentators who are very knowledgeable about the situation in Afghanistan, it was very clear that the Taliban would take over again. Some commentators thought it might be a few months, but actually in reality, it was only a few weeks. Having said that, it makes no sense that there was no plan to deal with what would happen after the fallout when it was very obvious what would happen. So I want to talk a little bit now about the international agreements. I think one of the things that this situation really illustrates is that international agreements can be very robust norms, but also quite fragile arrangements. So Australia is a party to a number of conventions regarding human rights and refugees, of course, and this includes the UN Convention on Human Rights and the UN Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. So the UN Convention on Human Rights, I'm sure many of you already know, is the basic international agreement which kind of quantifies what every individual human being should be entitled to in order to live a decent life. And the UN Convention on Refugees basically states that anybody who has a well-founded fear of persecution can be designated a refugee and can seek asylum in an external country. If we look at both of these agreements, it's clear that Taliban rule in Afghanistan is a threat to both of these international agreements. And I don't think anyone can argue against that. But the problem is not in recognizing the risk, but in deciding what to do next. What are the concrete steps that we as a country, as an international community, need to take in order to protect the lives of people in Afghanistan? So far, the Australian government has made some public statements. They have encouraged the Taliban to take steps towards peace, respect human rights, and there has been some talk here about humanitarian visas, which I'll talk about in a moment. But at the same time, the Australian government has also really tried to distance itself from the situation in Afghanistan. So they've parroted some of the talking points that have come from Joe Biden in the US, saying that it's the responsibility of people in Afghanistan to basically address the issues within their country. They can't rely on the international community to solve their problems anymore. If democracy is really that much of something that people really want, then it needs to come from the Afghan people. It can't be imposed from the outside. And I think there is a little bit of validity to those arguments, but it ignores the context here. So the context, I think, is that when the Allied forces, the US, Australia, and other NATO forces went into Afghanistan in 2001, there were promises made and implied by that intervention which have been broken with the withdrawal and with the lack of consideration for the humanitarian crisis. And in Australia, at least, this is very much related to domestic politics. So refugee issues have been quite contentious in Australia for a very long time, at least the last 2 decades. There is a lot of xenophobia. There is a lot of reluctance to open our borders to refugees, especially from particular countries and areas of the world. In terms of elections, it's not a very popular election issue. The major parties in Australia don't really like to talk about being welcoming to refugees because they think that Australian citizens generally are not very supportive of this. And that kind of is reflected in the response that we've seen so far. And the response so far, as of today, is that Australia has committed 3,000 refugee resettlement visas or humanitarian resettlement visas for people from Afghanistan. But the issue here is that this is not an increase from our annual resettlement quota. So this number actually comes out of the existing resettlement quota that we already have. So essentially there are no extra places for people coming from Afghanistan. And you might think, okay, 3,000 places, that's not too bad. But if we look at the history, it's actually very low. So looking back over the last 50 years or so, after the Vietnam War, Australia accepted 42,000 refugees. After the Tiananmen Square crisis in China, Australia accepted 42,000 refugees. After the Syria conflict, we accepted 12,000 refugees. And even last year, after the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, the Australian government committed to not 10,000 refugee places, but to allowing Hong Kong students who were studying in Australia to stay here and to get pathways to permanent residency and citizenship. And that was 10,000 students. So if you look at the 3,000 refugee places that have been designated for Afghan refugees, it's actually very low and not really consistent with previous humanitarian responses. Now, I just want to flag too that I'm portraying possibly a very negative picture of Australia and of the Australian government, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been community efforts to try and lobby the government to change their policy or to make it better. I'm sure that you all know with the last couple of years and COVID-19, there's been a lot of restrictions on protests and freedom of movement. We just came out of lockdown in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, but there have been a lot of online movements to try and change the government's response to the Afghan crisis. And there are some community movements to try and increase the refugee intake quota. Nothing has changed yet, but we may have an election coming up soon. So we'll see what happens with that. I just wanted to share too, I'm part of the executive of the Australian Studies Association of Australia. We also drafted a letter to 3 of the key government ministers to try and advocate particularly for attention to the right to education in Afghanistan and the need to make sure that the Australian government was doing everything that it could to ensure that particularly women and girls were able to obtain education in Afghanistan. We didn't actually receive a response to the letter, but there are different groups within the country who are very concerned about this as well. And I just want to finish with this question, and it really is a question because I don't have the answer. Well, I mean, I have an answer, but I don't have, I can't solve this problem on my own. I think there are a lot of questions and debates here about, in general, what are the legal responsibilities that we have to Afghanistan and what are the moral responsibilities that we have? And, you know, does protecting international conventions such as the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees and human rights constitute some kind of international legal responsibility? And the short answer to that question is no, it doesn't. These international agreements cannot dictate how states respond to international humanitarian crises. They merely give an indication of what standards we should expect internationally and what norms we should expect internationally. They can't give us guidance on, you know, how many refugees we need to support, what kind of funding we should be providing to international institutions. None of that is guided by these international agreements. So it's really up to every country individually to decide how it responds within this international context. And similarly, it is the right of any country or any state to withdraw from a conflict when they see fit. The Australian government decided to withdraw from Afghanistan after 20 years. That's had obviously implications for the people in Afghanistan, but there are no international conventions or laws that necessarily say that that decision is right or wrong. So the Australian government actually doesn't have any legal, within the international broader context, have any legal responsibilities to what's happening in Afghanistan or to the people of Afghanistan. But I think that doesn't mean that we don't have a moral responsibility. And I think part of this is the irony that when the Allied forces went into Afghanistan in 2001, as part of the war on terror, it was partially about fighting Al-Qaeda and different so-called terrorist groups, but it was more broadly about protecting humans and protecting people around the world, whether that was in the US or in other parts of the of the globe, or even within Afghanistan. So, part of the justification for going into Afghanistan in the first place was because the Taliban regime was abusing human rights, and that an allied intervention would actually help to prevent that into the future. The irony is now that the Taliban are back in charge and we're almost back to this similar situation that we were in 2001, and we don't know exactly what is going to happen from here. I think for the Australian government, this is almost like a failed experiment. They went in 2001, they had an idea of what they would achieve and what would happen. It didn't work out that way, and so now they are cutting their ties and walking away from that. I think the lingering question here was actually very well put by Professor William Malley, who was a presenter at a seminar here at the University of Sydney last month. And he asked, there was a promise that was made to the Afghan people that the Allies would not abandon them. So if this promise has been broken, then what is our responsibility to these people who are now suffering as a result of our decision? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I think that's a question that we need to keep asking ourselves, and something that we need to keep lobbying our governments for, to ensure that this situation remains in the spotlight and we don't forget or ignore what's happening in Afghanistan now. And I'm just going to put up a link here to that panel discussion, which is still online on YouTube. It's actually very interesting, and if you are interested in hearing about some of those perspectives, you can go onto YouTube and watch that presentation. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Associate Professor Elizabeth Kramer. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. And also we can see that the issue of refugee and also human rights has been a long-winding issue to defend and protect. And we can also see that there are various legislation on that regulates on this issue, but there are still more to do, and also the needs of international cooperation of states to stressing the purpose of protecting human rights. So we come to our second presenter. Our second presenter is Dr. Muhammad Ali Safaat. Dr. Muhammad Ali Safaat is currently served as the Dean of Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya. His expertise is constitutional law. Dr. Ali Safaat actively contributes to many prestigious journals on his research, and also he is also a distinguished expert and speaker in various seminars related to constitutional law. So Dr. Ali Safaat, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. I will share my presentation. Yeah. Okay, thank you for the time, and thank you for of the participant and committee that give me opportunity to join this international conference. And based on the theme of this international conference, I will present of course, in the wider international cooperation in promoting and protecting human rights, opportunity and challenges in the midst of uncertainty. The uncertainty conditions. I mean, here it's the outbreaks of coronavirus condition, and my presentation I will divide into 3 parts. The first one is, of course, concerning the condition impacted by the outbreak of the coronavirus in all over the world. And then the second of the impact of the pandemic situation to the human rights in all over the world, and especially, of course, in some cases in Indonesia. The third, the response of the state especially concerning the emergency law. And then the last, why we need the international cooperation and what kind of international cooperation that we need to stop or to manage to control the pandemic situation, because we don't know when the pandemic will be end. The first, I think we already aware and we experiences by ourselves that the COVID-19, the coronavirus disease 19, it's become the outbreak or pandemics because have at least 4 characters. The first is infectious, so it's easily infects the other people through the air, through the context between one human to the other human, and because of that, this virus spread fastly from one location to the other location, and also deadly because many people pass away because the virus, and then the resistance because this virus maybe cannot we cannot eliminate this virus totally, but we have to make some policy that we live together with the virus. The infectious, we can see from the December 2019, which the virus for the first time in Wuhan, China. The first time is 174 cases, and just less than 2 years in September. This is the data from September 15, 2021. It's already 225 and something cases in all over the world. 2004 countries has affected by this virus, and then 4.5 million people, the death toll of this COVID-19 virus. This is the description, the picture, how this virus infectious and deadly, and then spreads fastly from one country to the other country, and only needs for 1 year this virus infected all of the countries in the world. And then we also can see the problem of the coronavirus disease. It's the health facility. We can see every country that's not ready to manage the outbreaks, because we can see the number of hospital beds per 100,000 population. It's not equal in all of the world. We can see majority of the countries have less than 200 bed for 100,000 of their population. So when the outbreaks become in the peak situation, like in Indonesia in July, August, and September, so many hospital should be closed because cannot manage anymore, because they have a full capacity of their beds. And we can also see the data from Indonesia. This is the bed occupation ratio in Indonesia, in its province. That's in June 2021. Many provinces reached the red condition because of the 15% of their capacity. So this is how the coronavirus become the outbreak and become the condition in all over the world. And this condition have impacted to the human right. I can classify to impact, direct impact and indirect impact, or no direct impacts. The first one, indirect impact, of course, the right to health and the right to life. The right to health consists of course, the rights to life, because many people has been dead because these outbreaks, and then the right to health facilities, because not all of the country have capacity first to test the population, because test it's very important to prevent the spread of the virus. The second, the hospital, health facility in the hospital. Many countries in all over the world actually lack of the hospital, lack of the bed capacity in their hospital. The ICU facilities, because in the severe condition, the people that has been infected by coronavirus, of course, need ICU facilities in the hospital. The oxygen, we can also we experience this in Indonesia, and we can see what happened in India, in Myanmar, and the other country in Asia. And then, of course, the vaccine, because the vaccine it's right now the only treatment that can prevent the spread of the virus. For example, for the test capacity, we can see in this picture that the capacity of each state, I think it's in here in Africa, in Asia, of course in Indonesia, it's very little. They have the weakness in the test capacity. So this is not equality in health facility to prevent, to manage the coronavirus outbreak. And then this is the vaccine acceptance rates, 10%. We know based on this map that the Australia is very good, it's green, also Indonesia. But of course we have the problem because in some countries that not recognize the vaccine that's given in Indonesia, for example. So people in Indonesia cannot transport to example to the Europe country because the vaccine they get in Indonesia, it's what's they call the vaccine, Sinovac. So also we have the problem to freedom of movement. And this is the problem, the direct impact from the coronavirus disease outbreak. And then the second, it's non-direct impact. At least there are 4 kinds of human rights that's impacted by the pandemic situation. First, of course, freedom of movement, because the first action of the country usually when the outbreaks begin in other country, it's lockdown, close the entry point of the countries. Australia closed the Sydney airport from many countries, also Indonesia. And also in the steady condition, right, like right now, that some countries already open the gate, some region already open the gate. It's also regulate vaccine requirement to move to the other region or to the other countries, and then also to test requirement. So not every people can access the vaccine, not every people can access the test requirement to move to the other region, to the other countries. The second is freedom of assembly, and then freedom of speech and expression, and then rights to education, because the pandemic situation, of course, slow down the economic activity. Many people lose their job, and many students cannot continue their study. So this is the violation of the human right based on this condition. Based on the data from Indonesian Legal Aids Foundation, since the pandemic situation, there are 351 civil freedom cases. That's including freedom of speech and expression, 26%, right to demonstration, 20%. And I think it's not only in Indonesia, because every country have to limit the people to assemble in the public space because the health condition, so they limits the demonstration. And then freedom of speech and expression in digital media, 17%. And I think in all over the world also, the digital media become very, very important to the people because they can move, they can communicate physically, face to face to the other people. So they can communicate and meet and gather through digital media. But in this digital media, it's also a violation against freedom of speech and expression. And then rights of information, 16%, and then right of personal data, 16%. This is the condition in Indonesia, and I think it's also reflect in the other countries. The impact of the outbreak based on the policy that decides by every countries. You can see here school closing in many countries, workplace closing, council of public event, close public transport, public information campaign, and then restriction of internal movement, and also international travel control. And also some countries will make the new law or implement the law considering the fake news, because the fake news, they concern the fake news is one of the obstacle to manage or to control the outbreaks in some countries, also in Indonesia. Some people refuse the vaccine because they believe in something that's unreasonable concerning the vaccine. And I think also in the United States, in America, in the United Kingdom. And how the state respond to the condition, and that response also creates the impact to the human right. Every state, I think, declared the state of emergency, but not every state actually ready with the emergency law. If we see the emergency law in Indonesia, for example, or in other states, actually the emergency law is more concerned to the military threat, the foreign threat to the sovereignty of the state, of the countries, the threat concerning the territory, the integrity of the state, to the security, and then to the physical disaster. Very little and not very detailed law concerning how to manage, how to control in the emergency situation concerning the emergency because of certain disease, because the virus. This is the condition, the response of the states to the emergency condition. In the constitutional theory, actually we have two kind of paradigm. The first is constitutional dualism, and then the second is constitutional monoism. So in the constitutional dualism, the constitution and the law regulate both condition in normal and emergency condition. So in the normal condition, the states already regulate the emergency condition. Even this kind of law not yet implemented or not implemented in the normal condition. But when the normal condition fastly switch to the emergency condition, so this law should be implemented. And the other, it's constitutional monoism, that not regulate the emergency condition. So the law and the constitution only regulate normal condition. For the emergency, rest to the state authority. And of course, when these outbreaks come up, the state that already have the emergency law, they can implement the emergency law. But for the countries that do not have the emergency law, because they only constitutionally only regulates the normal condition, they have the problem. The problem first, how to manage the condition, and then the second, of course, the problem how to protect human right in the emergency condition, and then the problem how to control that the authority it's not abused by the state. So this is two paradigm or two classification in the emergency law. And for Indonesia, actually we have some of the emergency law for each kind of the emergency. Even actually in some of the emergency law, it also can apply to this condition right now. We have at least 6 emergency law. The first is the emergency condition, and then the infectious disease outbreak, Undang-Undang number 4 of 1984, and then the disaster management law, and then health law and social conflict measure law, and the last is health quarantine that's implemented to manage the coronavirus disease outbreak right now. Each of these law have the specific treatment, has the specific condition of the emergency. In the emergency condition, or in Indonesia we said Undang-Undang Bahaya, we have 3 kinds of emergency: civil emergency, military emergency, and war emergency. And if we look to the substance of civil emergency, actually the pandemic condition, it also can fit to the criteria to declare the civil emergency. And to the outbreak law, they have the concept of outbreak territory, actually, that need a special treatment from the government. And then disaster emergency in the disaster law, and then in the health law we have concept extraordinary condition, or Indonesia kejadian luar biasa. For example, when in some region that have very high malaria disease, so the government declare the extraordinary condition. We have a conflict condition in the conflict measurement law, and public health emergency, or Indonesia kedaruratan kesehatan masyarakat, that implements right now. In the health quarantine, actually not only regulates the public health emergency condition, but also regulate the health quarantine in normal condition. For example, how they checks the goods from the other countries that come into Indonesia, the plants, the animal, and the other, and regulate the public health emergency that consists of quarantine in entry point, isolation, home quarantine, and the other. The important is this law also regulates some of limitation to the human right. For example, based on this law, the limitation, the minimum limitation, consists of close the school. So it's been the limitation to the right to education, close working place. It's mean that limitation to the rights to the life, the rights to work, limitation of religious activities. It's mean limitation to the right to assembly, right, freedom of religion, limitation of public places. And this is widened by the Ministry of Health regulation. They add some activities that limit by the government. For example, limitation of social and cultural activities, limitation of transportation, and limitation of other activities. And from this law, including all of this law in Indonesia, we have some problem. The first one is who have the authority, because all of this law regulate differently to the authority to declare or to manage. For example, in disaster management, to declare the emergency condition, it's in the hand of head of National Bureau on Disaster. We call in Indonesia the NBB. For health quarantine law, the authority is in the Minister of Health. Even right now, we can see that the government create the special task force. So this is the first problem. Who have the authority? And what the job description, the distribution of the job between the central government, the Ministry of Health, the local government, the Bureau on Disaster, National Disaster Management, and then the task force. And then for the regulation, I think all of the regulation should be synchronized. And then right now we do not have the regulation to manage resources that needs to manage the pandemic, how to mobilize the private sector, the industry, for example, to product the oxygen, to product the health facilities or health instrument, the medicine and the other, and how to monitor the implementation of the regulation. How to test that some limitation, for example, the limitation to assembly, it's actually necessary and actually proportional to the condition. Who have the authority to evaluate whether the limitation it should be left now because the condition is already steady. So this is the problem of the regulation. And then the readiness. So we know that from this pandemic condition that the human life is very fragile. So we have to ready when these conditions come back with the other virus, of course. This is the problem. And for this problem, I think we need international cooperation first, because this is the pandemic condition. No one safe until everyone safe. Australia not entirely safe if people in Indonesia it's not safe. And then this pandemic condition is resistant. We don't know how long take time transfer from pandemic to the endemic. And we have the problem equal access to vaccine, because right now the vaccine is the only way to create herd immunity, because the scientists believe that we cannot eliminate totally the virus. So we just have to have the immunity to the virus. And this is concerning the right to life, of course, the right to health, freedom of movement, because the vaccine becomes the requirement to move from one region to the other region, and also freedom of assembly. The other problem, and of course, this is the kind of international cooperation that we need. It's concerning the poverty, because this condition makes or rise the number of the poverty, not only in the developing countries, also in the developed countries. So it's need humanitarian aid, especially to fulfill the right to health and right to education. And then I think international cooperation also needs to make standard concerning the proportionality and necessity of the limitation. So in each country, even they limit the human right, especially in freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of religion. They have the exact the instrument to evaluate, to decide whether the limitation is fits or not based on the proportionality and necessity deliberation. And then international cooperation also needs to monitor the condition, the authority of the state to prevent abuse of power, and also to increase the parliament capacity in monitoring the authority of the government in the pandemic condition. And we aware that the fragile world and fast spreading will make the emergency law maybe regularly enforced by the country or enforced in the worldwide, because in some condition. So because this is more regular, we need international standard of international emergency law, which right may be limited, in what condition, how long the limitation, and who have the authority to evaluate the limitation. Okay, I will stop in here in the international cooperation to prevent human rights violation in the uncertainty condition because the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you, Audrey.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Dr. Muhammad Ali Safaat. So everyone, we can see that the outbreak of COVID-19 requires not only international health regulation, but we also realize that the right of health, that everyone has equal access, is important. So it is an obligation for states to do such international cooperation in providing proportional services, monitoring and control of the pandemic, and also in implementing standard in tackle the virus outbreak. So now we come to the third speaker in our first panel. Our third speaker is Ms. Laura Baron Mendoza. Ms. Laura Baron Mendoza currently is a PhD candidate at McGill University, Canada, and she obtained her master's degree on international humanitarian law and human rights from Geneva and Academy, Switzerland. She is also the founder of APD Colombia and Canada Lawyer Without Border. But unfortunately, due to the health issue and urgent matters, Dr. Laura Baron Mendoza cannot join us in person by Zoom. But she has been sending her video on the issue that she will present today on this first panel. So can I?
Good morning, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Good night to me. Thank you to the university for this scenario. I'm really glad to be here, to be able to learn from you, and also to share with you some of my work on the field and my doctoral project. I hope I will be able to share with you this in person someday. So some of you know that I'm a Colombian lawyer, and I have been working on the human rights and IHL and transitional justice field during almost 10 years. So in that sense, one of the scenarios that have called my personal and professional attention is what makes people join an armed group, and who are we to judge such decisions when in most cases those decisions are linked with a context that most of us ignore. So this being said, I would like to introduce you two things. So first, the general lines of my research project as a doctoral candidate at McGill University, and my personal project, which is based on a professional and a personal commitment. So in regard with my research, it is based in two theoretical bases, which is legal pluralism and rebel governance. As we all know, armed conflicts of non-international character prevail in number over international armed conflicts. And armed groups defined, or armed actors, non-state armed actors defined as organized actors with a basic structure of command operating outside state control that uses force to achieve their objectives have acquired an indispensable role in the international sphere, specifically regarding international lawmaking and law enforcement. And as an example, legal scholars have largely analyzed how ANSAs, armed non-state actors, administer justice and provide fair trial guarantees through courts the courts that they convened. Although their role has caught the attention of states, the reasons to engage with them prevail and remain limited. For instance, in 2009, the Secretary General of the United Nations identified several challenges that involved the need to engage with ANSAs, aiming to improve their behavior due to the lack of compliance with international law. So this research is grounded on the need for engagement between armed non-state actors and states, not only to promote compliance, but also to promote dialogue between conflicted parties and contribute with state-building processes during the aftermath of an armed conflict. This is far from the traditional militaristic policies to counterinsurgency. I think that engagement with ANSAs is crucial to establish dialogue, primarily when the drastic choice of militarily defeating them kind of collapses. So, however, engaging with ANSAs is usually problematic. Their modus operandi tends to delegitimize these actors' actions before the states, and their infraction of national and international law provides them an outlawed status that has barred them from being perceived as law creators, despite being a party to a conflict. So, ANSAs are usually catalogued as terrorist networks, bandits, and also state-building spoilers. Indeed, the evocation of resistance in non-international armed conflict using violence is often related to chaos, fear, destruction, irrationality, and also the vulnerability of population dominated by non-state armed actors. Yet, the Hobbesian juncture, which indicates that the state is the only able to provide order, is known to be inaccurate. Conversely, ANSAs have a non-negligible sorry for my English, role in governance and norm setting also, or standardization, to the extent of even competing with government functions at some times or at some point. So based on the legal pluralism scholarship, I focus on the scenarios of combative and competitive legal pluralism to disclose the complex relationship between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the Colombian state. And just to quickly introduce that, Colombian armed actors vary from guerrillas, narco-traffic networks, gangs to paramilitaries. All of them operate and rule distinctly according to their goals and strategies. And rebel legal practices in rural areas of Colombia increased since the beginning of the 21st century. So my research addresses the land governance by envisaging 3 areas where legal clashes could be identified beforehand. So land tenure, the production of coca crops, and the environmental protection in FARC-controlled territories. And my purpose is to analyze and compare the rules imposed by FARC and the state's regulation on the matter in order to understand how the population finds themselves between the legal systems and how the neglect of FARC's law impacts state building processes. So that's the general frame of my research. And what I'm gonna do is that obviously there are lots of questions that derive from it and expect to be answered effectively during the following months and even years. So the second thing that I want to share with you is also my personal project called Abibe. And this is a project based on the belief that peace building can be promoted through reading. So for the past 3 years, nearly 4 years, I have been doing ethnographic work with former members of the armed group FARC, which signed a peace agreement with the Colombian government in 2016. The intention was to make visible voices, their perspective of war. And this is why I wrote a book which is composed of 17 life stories of 17 ex-FARC, focusing in 3 stages: their childhood, the moment they joined the group, and their present. What we all ignore is the need to listen, to get close to realities that seem far from us but that are just right at the corner. In Colombia, we say do not let your privilege blind you. So this book has the intention to open some eyes and allow us to have different approaches to war and to those who had an active role in hostilities. What is different is that this book tells not only their life stories, but it brings historical facts to the table. It links that history with the present, and it makes evident the different realities that we all live in, which makes us incapable of judging. Therefore, Abive is a channel that I have created to contribute to the reintegration process of these ex-combatants. While a person buys a book, that person will be reading, learning, perhaps changing their perceptions, or at least questioning themselves about how they feel about armed conflict, and finally contributing economically to improve the living conditions of this group of people. So we are currently raising money to improve the living conditions of 2 people who share their lives with me. One of them is a 60-year-old man, a founder of one of the FARC fronts during the 70s, and the other has one disability after he lost his leg in a surgery, which is a paradox because he was in charge of building the landmines. So he then says that he is paying the price of it. So this is what I had to share with you today. I was hoping to be with you at least online, but I hope I will have another chance to do so. And I really hope that as lawyers, we start interacting with different fields and making the difference on the field, not only through or on the book. Goodbye.
So that's the end of presentation of Miss Laura Peron Mendoza. Now we come to the end of the presentation, and we will come to the Q&A session. So everyone, you can either ask your question by raise your hand, your virtual hand, or chat. Give the chat in the chat box. So this is the first question from Ibu Hikmatul Ula. The question to Dr. Elizabeth Kramer, that relating with the situation in Afghanistan now, how is the international community can control the fulfillment of fundamental rights? I think this is, I think Miss Elizabeth Kramer can answer this one while we are
I should
waiting.
answer straight away.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I'm not sure if it was clear from my presentation, but I think there are 2 things going on here. I think from a sovereignty perspective, we don't have a lot of control over what is happening inside Afghanistan. I think with the withdrawal of the Allied troops, the opportunities for intervention into the way that Afghanistan is managed by the Taliban and their government regulations that they issue I think the international community has very little ability to influence that right now. There may be a changing situation if the Taliban government decides that it wants to seek international legitimacy. For example, if they wanted to join the UN or be recognized by the UN, then maybe there would be more opportunity to influence the internal policies and regulations, but that hasn't happened yet. So from my perspective, I think the best way, maybe the only way, that the international community can contribute to the fulfillment of human rights is to invest in and support refugee resettlement programs to other countries around the world. To give people in Afghanistan who have a legitimate fear of persecution, and there are a lot of people who have a legitimate fear of persecution in Afghanistan right now, to give them an opportunity, a clear opportunity to apply for resettlement in other countries. I think that at the moment is the only thing that the international community can really do. There are many, many countries in the world that do not offer humanitarian resettlement programs, so that would be a very big shift in their domestic policies. But for countries like the United States, Canada, Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, we actually already have these programs in place. So it's a matter of targeting some of that assistance to people from Afghanistan and also increasing the number of people that we can support. So I hope that answers your question. I think that is probably the main way that we can work as an international community right now. Hopefully there will be opportunities in the future to do more within Afghanistan to protect people who can't leave or maybe don't want to leave.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. So is there any comments from Ms. Ula?
Okay, no, I think it's already clear from Elizabeth Kramer presentations, but unfortunately in Indonesia we have no regulations about the refugee, including refugee, because we are not part of the refugee conventions. But if there is maybe maybe Afghanistan refugee come to Indonesia, we still have a non-refoulement principle that all the countries cannot bring back the refugee to the dangerous country. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sigmatul Ula. And I also want to ask a question for Dr. Ali Safaat. I want to ask, relating in tackling this COVID pandemic, is there maybe any assistance if a country willing to end the pandemic case in the country but unable to provide because maybe some obstacles like the facilities of health and also technology or something? Is there maybe any assistance from other states that maybe apply in tackling the pandemic? And also there is also a question from Priska listening room to Dr. Ali Safaat also. Would you share us what we can learn from the pandemic situation, and is there any future legislation that should be proposed? And also for Dr. Elizabeth Kramer, the question is on the issue of Afghanistan. Could you share the update on the situation of Aboriginal tribe there, because you are living in Australia? Because there is some issue that there is some unfortunate on their fulfillment of human rights. Is it correct? And I also kindly remind for the participants to fill the presentation, the form in the chat box for the attendance. Thank you. Maybe you can answer. Maybe Pak Ali dulu, Mr. Ali Safaat.
Okay, thank you very much for the first question, considering the height from the other states to the other state concerning the management or to handle the pandemic situation. As I said in our presentation, in my presentation, that's from this pandemic condition, we can learn that this pandemic cannot be solved by one single countries or the one single country works alone, because no one safe until everybody is safe from the coronavirus disease. So giving the aid for the other countries is not only for the other people in these countries in humanitarian perspective, because we cannot let the other people in the other countries die because the coronavirus, but also to our safety. And then I think it's not only G to G, government to government, but also for corporation, because we know the facility, the health facility produced by the corporation, for example, the vaccine, the oxygen, the ICU instrument is also produced by the corporation. So I think the cooperation between countries and between corporation in all over the world, it's needed by humanity to stop, to manage this pandemic condition. We know that many countries also give aid for India, for Indonesia, when we in the peak condition of the pandemic situation. Even in the beginning, some of the country keep their vaccine production to their population, but I think it's not cannot do anymore, because when the people of the other country it's not get the vaccine, so this virus can spread again. We maybe face the third wave of the outbreak. This is how the international cooperation it's necessary to stop this outbreak of the coronavirus. And then the second from Ibu Priska, of course, in the future, we need one regulation that synchronize the emergency law. Each of the emergency have their own characteristic. For example, for the law of emergency, actually they create to face the physical threat, the military threat, the security threat. And then for the disaster management law, actually they face the problem of the disaster that we only manage the impact of the disaster. For example, the earthquake, how to fast to help the people, the victim of the earthquake, and then how to reconstruct the facility, the infrastructures, and the other. But for the coronavirus outbreak, we face the other threat that different characteristic, because we are not only to manage the impact of the outbreak, but also we have solved the source of the outbreak itself, that is the virus. And then of course this is needs a different action from the government. So this emergency law should be synchronized, and we have one emergency law that's very comprehensive, that's coordinated the authority of the government from the central to the local, and also have to regulate how to monitor the limitation of the human rights by the policy of the government. And when the limitation should be lifted because the condition it's already solved by the government and by the people. So we need the synchronized regulation in Indonesia. And also I read the question from Panita Kaison from Thailand concerning the cooperation between civil and military. Actually, in all of the emergency law, in the health quarantine law, in the health law, in the infectious disease law, the authority is still in the civilian, in the government. The authority to declare, the authority to act, the authority to make regulation. But of course, in this law, stated that all of the state organ, including the army, including the military, have to help the civil authority to mobilize the resources that have by the military to manage the condition, except in the emergency law, in the military emergency and war emergency, the top authority, the supreme authority, it's in the hand of the military organ, in the central government, in the national military, and then also in the local or provincial or regional government. It's in the hand of the military. This is only in the military emergency, which is to the threat from the outside military forces or the expedition, and in the war emergency. So only in two emergency condition that's military have the supreme or top authority to manage the condition, the emergency condition. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also there are quite a lot of questions now. There's also a question from Bumilda, also for Alisa Faat. She asked that, do you have any other alternative proposal for democracies to act more decisively related with the COVID? And also to Dr. Elizabeth, the UN, do you think that the situation in Afghanistan is critical for the UN to establish an international fact-finding mechanism to monitor human rights and publicly report on the situation? And also to Dr. Alisa Faat, is there also any best practices by countries that we can refer to in limiting human rights proportionality during this pandemic? Thank you.
Would you like me to respond first?
Yeah, Dr. Elizabeth Kramer.
Okay, I might start with the question about Afghanistan and then go back to the question about Indigenous or Aboriginal rights in Australia. So the question is about the International Criminal Court and the role that the ICC has in prosecuting crimes against humanity and war crimes. And this is actually a really interesting question and very complicated. Firstly, and I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure how this works, but with the change of government, or actually not a change of government, a change of regime, I'm not sure that Afghanistan, the new Afghan government or the Taliban government can be held to the agreements that the previous government has made. So I'm not sure whether there's a mechanism to roll over their membership or subscription to the ICC. That's one issue. But the bigger issue, I think, here is if we start looking at war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan, it's not just the Taliban who are implicated in that. So, for example, here in Australia last year, there was a commission, a royal commission into crimes against humanity committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan and the killing of civilians. And I think there have been a number of accusations also made against US troops who were working in Afghanistan as well. So it's kind of like a bit of a Pandora's box. If you start prosecuting one side, then other sides also become culpable and implicated. And that brings the question of who exactly is going to bring these charges to the ICC. I can't imagine that the Australian government or the US government would be interested in opening cases against the Taliban on the chance that then the ICC then starts to prosecute people from the US or people from Australia or other allied forces for things that have happened in Afghanistan. So it's actually a very complicated question, even though it seems quite straightforward. The second question about the UN monitoring the situation, I think in a perfect world, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be in this situation, but ideally, yes, the UN would monitor the situation in Afghanistan and human rights. But the problem with that is access. So it could be seen as a violation of state sovereignty if the UN were to go into Afghanistan without the permission of the government to conduct a fact-finding mission. I think it's unlikely, seems unlikely at the moment that the Taliban would give the UN access to come into the country and to conduct a thorough review. So I think for things like that, at the moment, the international community is probably going to be relying on non-government organizations, human rights organizations to be collecting data from what's happening within the country. They might have, not spies, that's not the right word. They might have people within Afghanistan who are reporting incidences to them, and then from the outside, they can make those public. But I think in terms of operating within Afghanistan, it's going to be very difficult right now. And I know that there are lots of NGOs who, up until, August this year, had offices, had staff members in Kabul and other parts of the country, and they've all left because of, what was happening. So it's a situation where I think we're going to be relying on the NGOs and human rights organizations to continue to report on that. Hopefully the UN will be able to play a part in that, whether that's through funding NGOs or funding human rights organizations to continue that work. But I think officially it would be very difficult for the UN to conduct any official fact-finding missions right now. The other question about, I'm just scrolling up, Aboriginal tribes in Australia. Gosh, I don't even really know where to start with this. It's not my area of expertise, but I can try and point you in the right direction. I'm not sure how familiar people are with the status of Indigenous rights and the situation of Indigenous people in Australia, but there is a big discrepancy in terms of human development, in terms of access to services, education, a whole range of issues. The governments for the last 50 years have been trying to address this problem. But I think the fundamental issue, there are two fundamental issues here. The first goes back to when the English came to Australia and claimed it as British land. So I'm sure everybody knows that Australia was originally a British colony, so back in the 1700s. And the legal mechanism under which that colonization occurred was a law called terra nullius. And that law, which was a British law, said that if a land is unoccupied, uninhabited, basically the first country that gets there can claim it. And that's what they did. Now, the problem with that is that there were actually already people in Australia. And for a very long time, they weren't recognised as citizens. Actually, when the Australian Constitution was written in 1901, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, were classified as fauna. They weren't classified as citizens. And it wasn't until the 1960s, 1970s that the Constitution was changed to actually recognise Indigenous people as citizens. So we're talking about decades of structural injustice, which cannot be overcome with just, one government policy now. It's very complicated. And the second issue is the issue of land rights. So I think in the 1990s, there was a High Court case, which is a constitutional case in Australia, that found that there was one man, Eddie Mabo, he lodged a constitutional claim to an island, which he said his ancestors, his traditional Indigenous tribe, had lived on that island for centuries. And he lodged an ownership claim of that island, and it was approved by the High Court. So when that happened, that meant that any Indigenous tribe or any Indigenous person in Australia could lodge a land rights claim if they could establish ongoing ancestral ownership of the land. And that led to a lot of issues because there were settlers, not just from England, but also now in Australia. We're quite a multicultural country, so people from all over the world live here now. And there is this sort of underlying fear that if you own land or if you own a company that's set on a particular land, not really in Sydney and Melbourne and places like that, but in the country, that you could have your land taken away from you if an Indigenous claim is approved by the courts. So this has led to a lot of tension in Australian society about, how much can we recognise Indigenous rights alongside maintaining tenure rights and land rights of non-Indigenous citizens. It's not really been solved, to put it bluntly. There's, actually even just this year, there was a big court case because there was a mining company that started drilling and blowing up land for, I can't remember, as a copper mine or something in Western Australia. And it turned out that that land was actually Indigenous land, and they hadn't gotten the correct permission to do the mining there. And so the Indigenous tribe sought an injunction, but that company has invested millions of dollars into this mine. And so I think it's going to court, or it will go to court soon, to see what happens. But, there's just so many issues. It's interesting when you start talking about human rights in other countries and people ask you questions about human rights in your own country. It's very complicated. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Yeah, thank you for the response, Dr. Elizabeth. And also we have a tight schedule, so I think we have the last.
Miss Panita, from Dr. Panita.
Oh yeah. Okay, Dr. Panita.
No, already asked, and Dr. Ali already answered my question. Thank you.
Okay. So we have the last three questions, I think, from Nadia, Putri Maharani, and the students here. And the questions goes to Mr. Ali Safaat. How does the government fulfill their rights during this pandemic efficiently? And if the government cannot do so, does it violate people's rights? And Also, the question again to Dr. Elizabeth Kramer, based on the human rights, what is the relationship between the human rights and international humanitarian law? And is there any conditions that must not be violated in international humanitarian law related to human rights? And which country have the international humanitarian law? And also to Dr. Elizabeth Kramer, in your opinion, do you believe that Afghanistan under Taliban will protect human rights better? If yes, on which justification? And the last question also goes to Mr. Ali Safaat that will close the session from Nebraska Alam. According to social restriction, is there what is the real connection between the COVID outbreak restriction on the freedom of expression? Because he thinks that freedom of expression has not only actually realized in real world. Thank you very much. Maybe Pak Ali, Dr. Ali Safaat will answer the question first.
Okay, thank you. I will answer generally, because the restriction or the limitation of the human right in the pandemic situation, it's concerning the limitation of the human rights, whether it's legitimate in the democratic society or not. And this is also concerning the question concerning the best practices, the limitation in the pandemic situation. In international law, I think we have the Siracusa principle that have the measure how to the limitation of the human right can held by the state in certain condition. The legitimate reason to the limitation of human rights in the coronavirus pandemic condition right now, actually the issue is the human dignity, the first, and then the second is the human and public safety. So which one should be limit? We have the necessary test, whether a certain limitation is necessary to protect the human dignity and then the public safety or not. And then, okay, this is necessary to limit, whether the limitation is meet to the requirement to protect the human dignity and public safety, and is there any other lighter limitation that can decide by the government to achieve to make that condition, to make the public safety protected by the state. So this is the normative in the international, I think, international human rights law. And of course, in this pandemic condition, we can make some kind of leveling of the human right, just like the question. The first one, of course, I think the opportunity to limit the freedom of movement, it's very important to protect the public safety. And then this is a little bit have the far correlation with the public safety, and then far correlation to the human dignity. It means that by the limit of the freedom of movement, the people still have human dignity. The second one, of course, freedom of peaceful assembly, because the people still have the dignity. The people still have the individual safety and then public safety if the government limit the public assembly or peaceful assembly, even for social and cultural activity or for the religion activity. And then The third one is freedom of speech and freedom of expression. As the question that actually this is not have a close correlation to the policy of the government to manage the pandemic's condition. So the people still have the rights to express their opinion, to speech, whether the policy of the government is unable to manage the condition, whether the people is suffering because the government closed the gate of certain region, because the government closed the workplace and the other. So actually, the government or the state, it's not needs to limit the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, whether in digital media or in published media. I think it's less reasonable to limit the freedom of speech and expression. It's different with the limitation to assembly, with the limitation to the freedom of movement. So I think this is a kind of the creed of the human right that can be limited by the government in manage the pandemic situation. I think this is the general answer for that, maybe 2 or 3 questions. Thank you, Audrey.
You're welcome, Mr. Ali Safaat. And to Dr. Elizabeth Kramer.
Okay, so the first question was about the relationship between human rights and international humanitarian law. So I would say that the way to explain it is that human rights are a norm, whereas international humanitarian law are rules. So norms can be guided by documents or conventions, but they can also change. And there's no, it's like a general consensus about what we all agree is, our expectation of what human beings should be entitled to and what freedoms they should be allowed to enjoy. International humanitarian law takes it a step further, so that if those norms are being breached, then there is recourse for prosecution or punishment to the parties who have contravened those human rights. The thing with international humanitarian law is that because we work generally on a consensus opt-in basis, national sovereignty is still very crucial when looking at how we view human rights and how we prosecute abuses of human rights. So in terms of international humanitarian law, for example, somebody already asked about the International Criminal Court. So the International Criminal Court, countries around the world can opt in. They can choose to be part of, they can choose to be signatories to the International Criminal Court, which means that they approve of the mandate of the International Criminal Court, and they sometimes provide funding or resources or things like that. But it's essentially up to the ICC to decide who gets prosecuted and what case is mounted against those people. So that's a very bureaucratic and kind of planned process. There are mechanisms behind what happens, who can do what, that sort of thing. I think if you want to look at that difference, human rights is sort of the general ideas, and the international humanitarian law is, the actual practical application of those laws and who, how they're applied and what the punishments are. I don't have a full list of all of the countries that have signed up to the international conventions and the humanitarian laws and human rights. There are a number of them, but you can look them up on the UN website, which houses most of them. So if you're interested, you can look there. The question about whether I think the Taliban will protect human rights better. This is actually also a very interesting question. And I'll tell you why. So when the Taliban took over, they did make some statements to basically say, you know, this new Taliban government is not going to be like the government from the 1990s, from the early 2000s. We have changed. We have different perspectives on, you know, how to run the country, what kinds of rules we're going to implement. So there was, at the very beginning, maybe a little bit of ambiguity about how the Taliban would choose to rule the country. But I think since then we have seen some of the edicts that have come out, especially about women's education and women's freedom of movement, suggesting that they are going to move in a more conservative direction. Now, whether this is, I mean, this also comes back to the question of what you think human rights are, doesn't it? So, I mean, for me, I'm working from the UN Convention, and some of the rules that the Taliban have already put in place are a clear breach of the UN Convention on Human Rights. And so that's the perspective that I'm coming from. The other way to look at it is whether within Afghan society, there is a general consensus of the new norms. And so it's a question of whether people within Afghanistan feel that they're being oppressed as well. And we can't necessarily, well, I mean, I am, but we can't necessarily, as a rule, apply international norms to particular countries and particular contexts, because if we think about sovereign states and the ideals of democratic rule, it's really up to the people in that country to determine what is acceptable for them and what is okay for them. So from that perspective, the Taliban regime is interesting, but personally, this is my personal view, and people are free to debate it. I think that human rights will suffer under the Taliban. I think that there are a number of groups who will not have access to things that they previously had access to when the allied troops and the democratic government were there. Whether things like standards of living, access to resources, whether those things change for the positive, it's possible. And if that happens, then you may see people within the country start to become more and more okay with the Taliban regime. But that is pure speculation. I couldn't say at this point if that's going to happen. And my gut feeling is that it's going to get worse, not better. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the response, Dr. Elizabeth Kramer. So everyone, I'm afraid this is the end of the first panel. We are very delighted for the insightful material from the speakers. And also we would like to say our warm thank you for the wonderful presentation for all speakers, Dr. Alisa Faat, Associate Professor Elizabeth Kramer, and also Miss Elizabeth Mendoza. So we will have now, we will have a break now, and on the 11 o'clock, there will be the start of the chamber presentation. There are 4 chamber presentation for the first session. So the participants can choose which chamber to enter. And also please be prepared for all speakers in both 4 chambers. So I will give to to Miss Belinda again for the MC, and thank you very much for all the speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Patricia Audrey.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Alisa Faat.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. After this, you will join the chamber that has been determined by the committee. Please, ladies and gentlemen, join in the breakout room that has been provided. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Dr.
Vanita.
See you
See you
tomorrow
tomorrow.
See you
again.
tomorrow. See you tomorrow.
On the next part.
Bu Ula nih sampai jam 11 ya?
Iya, jam 11.
Saya nanti kebagian di chambernya Bu Milda ya.
Ya.
Halo, suara
I
saya
want
terdengar ya?
I went into chamber 3, but then I returned to the main station. So what do I have to do now?
Yeah, we lost the, I think we lost the breakout room.
Oh, all right.
Mas Fahron, can you tell us why?
Mr. Faron still close the breakout room.
Ini dibuka sekarang ya? Apa nanti jam 11?
Yes, yes, you can open right now. Okay.
Ini nanti untuk chamber 1, 2 sampai 4 saya jadikan co-host ya, masing-masing ininya apa namanya? PIC ya gini nih ya penyebutannya ya.
Moderator.
Moderator saya jadikan co-host. Jadi nanti di dalam chamber bisa masing-masing moderator itu record to cloud ya. Jadi nanti kita ada rekamannya di tiap-tiap chamber. Kalau live soalnya kita nggak bisa kalau sudah jadi breakout room. Mungkin gitu ya. Mas Agis, Doni, Sopiki, Bu Patricia sama Mbak Ula. Itu ya. Mas Agis. Hmm.